The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning. A warm welcome to everyone who's in the webinar today from Lindsay and Gilmore. I'm looking forward to the next half an hour and launching this the 5 Conversations framework. Apologies for last week with sound. When I apologise, it wasn't something I was deliberately doing, but sometimes these things happen. I'm hoping I'm coming across loud and clear now. We sort of did a bit of a sound check at the beginning. Good. Okay. Sounds like if you want to just give me an indication that I'm being heard, that would be great. I've got Phil's confirmation. Okay. All right. Sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. Okay. Now, this is really exciting to think that very shortly we're going to be involving ourselves in this particular approach, which is the 5 Conversations framework. I gave a bit of an overview last week, and what I want to concentrate on this evening, or in your case the morning, is the climate review conversation, which I want you to get started pretty much as soon as I finish this this webinar. So you can basically start anytime as of now. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview as to what to expect. And I realise that we've got people in the audience here who will be administering conversations on the one hand, and there'll be others who'll be on the receiving end. So you will find that there'll be something useful for both of you in this broadcast. So let's have a look at what I'll be covering in this process. Every time I do one of these half an hour webinars, which will bookend each of the 5 conversations, I just wanted to come back to the big picture, which of course is the framework that you're using. So I just wanted to, so it basically looks at the before and after, and really you'll be sick of me by the end of this looking at the framework, but understanding how it all integrates. Obviously, we'll spend the majority of our half an hour together this morning looking at the climate review conversation. And in particular, what I want to look at there is the questions that will be asked in that conversation and how you deal with those. And then I also want to talk about some, well, fairly generic tips and hints on how you can make your conversations more effective from my own experience. So we'll talk about that. So I want you to relax and enjoy the 5 Conversations framework. It's not supposed to be onerous. It's actually supposed to be quite enjoyable. And all I'm doing is giving you a framework to be having conversations with either your boss or your team members. And these are conversations that I'd argue you should be having anyway. But because busyness is often the thing that gets in the way, so that's what stops us often. Okay. So let's also understand what the 5 Conversations is about. Now, you may well get a question during the process, particularly in the early stages, about what's this 5 Conversations framework all about? That's if you're a leader, and of course, if you're a leader, you're going to need to be able to answer that question as well. So let's have a look at a couple of the objectives about what the process is. It's really, the purpose is to develop higher trust levels, and I talked a little bit about this last week. At the end of the day, it is about building higher trust levels. And how does that occur? Well, obviously, if you're having a number of structured conversations around development, it's highly likely that the trust levels will increase, and you'll find that as you go through the process. Also, it's about creating some synergy, in other words, to be on the same page as the other person, or at least to agree to disagree if that's the case. So it's really about understanding other perspectives, and it's also about developing ways and means of assisting people to excel in their work. So you'll find that there will be lots of things that will come up in these conversations that will be very practical in nature and will help people to be able to invest in the development of the people working with them. So 3 key things, and the argument is if all those 3 things are happening, it's highly likely that a whole lot of other things will happen. And I guess, as Phil mentioned last week, it creates cross-functional or cross-organisational communication, which is really important. All right. And look, if you've got any questions or comments throughout, please let me know. That would be great. All right. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the conversation itself. That is the climate review conversation. Now, this will come up on your screen very soon. Okay, there we go. Um, all right. So what are we trying to do in the climate review? Now, the whole purpose of this is it's designed to be a fairly broad, easy conversation to get into. Now, be warned, you may find that this conversation takes longer than 20 minutes. And the reason for that is it's wide ranging. It's talking about job satisfaction, it's talking about morale, and it's talking about communication. So really, it could well go for longer than 20 minutes, and also because it's the first of the 5 conversations, it's highly likely that'll be the case. No problem. And I did promise you that the conversations in general would last 20 minutes. These may last a little bit longer, but that's okay. The first conversation is a bit of rapport building as well in some senses. So it's about gauging people's job satisfaction, communication, and morale. So what level are people enjoying their job? At what level are they enjoying their job? And what sort of communication's going on? Perhaps in head office, or perhaps it might be in the stores or in the area generally. How is communication going? And how would you consider morale, generally speaking? So they're pretty straightforward questions, which pretty much opens up an opportunity to have a conversation about how things are, generally speaking. And these things, of course, are never discussed in the normal hurly-burly of work. And of course, it's about considering ways and means of improving these areas of job satisfaction, morale, and communication. So you can see that that's pretty much the essence of it. And it's a fairly harmless conversation, and it's a very interesting conversation because it's not the sort of conversation that people normally would have, although I suspect they probably should. All right, so that's the overview. Now, there's the framework which you would have seen last week, and you would have also seen from what Phil distributed as well with an article. But it's important to just get a handle on where the conversations are going. Obviously, we're right at the beginning in the climate review, and then we move on to a strengths and talents conversation. And bear in mind, you've got 2 months to knock off each conversation. So, but I strongly recommend you do this immediately. Get into it, and don't wait until the last minute before we're ready to go into the strengths and talents conversation. The opportunities for growth conversation in month 3, and then we go to learning and development. And as I mentioned last week, out of those 2 conversations, that is people's strengths and people's opportunities for growth, it's highly likely that there'll be some learning and development opportunities. And and that's not necessarily sending people off to courses, but it may well be coaching or explaining how something works in more detail and so forth. So that's very, very important to do that. All right. So, and then of course we've got an innovation and continuous improvement conversation at the end, or the final conversation. And then once we've done all that, we go round again. And perhaps next time we might look at doing these once a month. It depends on how we go. But I realise this is a culture change for a lot of you, and it might seem rather strange to start with. But if you think about it, it's perfectly natural. We have conversations every day in every way with all sorts of people about a range of things. Some are positive, some are negative, some are boring, some are interesting. And the truth is, we're all well versed in having conversations, so it's not terribly difficult to do that. The good news about this process is that you're already being given the questions to ask. So it's just a case of you tailoring it to the way you want to communicate. So that's the process that we need to consider. Now let's talk about the questions that are going to be asked in the conversation. So I want to go through these and take a little bit of time. I've tried to put all these on the one slide, and the reason for that is that I'll be sending you the slides later today, and also I'll be sending you the um, the video as well. So you'll get both of those things. And I just wanted to keep them all on one page, so it was very simple to just look and take a glance at the 9 questions that you need to ask in this conversation. So the very first question, and those of you who are on the receiving end of a conversation, your responsibility in all this is to think about the answers to each of these questions prior to the conversation, because we don't want you to go in blindsided. We want you to come in prepared. We want you to have a meaningful conversation with your leader, so that both of you can have a rich conversation. So there's a little bit of homework from the person being on the receiving end of the conversation here. So the first question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? Now, the reason for asking that question is so that we can get a bearing on where people are at. And it's a much easier way of asking than just to blurt out a question like, how is your job satisfaction at the moment? Because it's it sort of seals off a meaningful answer in many ways. If someone says, oh, it's okay, or could be better, or it's pretty good, doesn't tell you much. But if you, so the person might answer that, and of course they can give it whatever score they wish. And of course, if you give it a 6, you can understand what the next question would be, which is really, why do you give it this rating? And my tip there for you as a leader is to ask that question and then just sit back if you're sitting down. I'd probably suggest you do it sitting down, and just let the other person elaborate on why they've rated it as they have. Now, as we probably all know, job satisfaction ebbs and flows. So sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. You're dealing with a cranky customer, you're dealing with an irate stakeholder, you're dealing with someone in government who's being a little bit bureaucratic. It could just automatically dampen your job satisfaction for the day or even the week or perhaps even the month. So these things go up and down. It's only a moment in time that you're asking this question. The other interesting thing about job satisfaction that's important to realise is that not everybody believes that it can be necessarily a 10. There are people who have preconceived ideas about job satisfaction and believe that 6 is as good as it gets. So don't be concerned about that, because it's better than it being a 2, of course. But the main purpose of questions 1 and 2 is really just to start a conversation around how people are feeling about their current job. And when you ask why did you give it that rating, then obviously what you're doing is you're eliciting something that's important to the other person in relation to job satisfaction. Okay, so listen carefully. Don't just seal off that answer immediately and move on to question 3. Ask them some probing questions. So, well, tell me a little bit about that. Can you give me an example? Or when was the last time that happened? Or how did it occur? Or anything along those lines. The whole purpose of that is to draw out the other person, and bear in mind that it's not confronting, because the argument is that the other person on the receiving end of this conversation should have already thought about that. So they're probably thinking about examples anyway. Now, once you feel that you've achieved that, you can store that in your memory bank, what the rating is and why. But then the next set of questions are around morale. So morale meaning, as the French call esprit de corps, or this is the general atmosphere, if you like, of the work team, wherever that work team might be in the business. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate morale in the section or the team you're working in? Now, obviously, you put your own words in there. If it is in a retail outlet, or if it's head office, you can say that. So what you do there is you give the person an opportunity to give it a rating. Now again, like job satisfaction, morale will ebb and flow depending on what's going on at the time, how much change is occurring, how insecure people feel, what sort of response they've had from the public if they're dealing with the public on the day. So that'll go up and down. But the question 4 is really, why did you give it this rating? So hopefully you get some critical incidents or examples that might help to explain why they rated it as they do. So it'll be very interesting for you as a team leader or a person who's who's administering these conversations to hear what people have got to say about that. What you might find very interesting is people have got different points of focus when they talk about morale or job satisfaction indeed, or communication. So that in itself can be very, very interesting to hear what's important to the other person. So have a listen about morale. Now remember, morale in this instance is only in relation to the team, that is the group of people that they're working with. And your business is fairly is a reasonable size, so we're not necessarily talking about another team. We're simply talking about your team. All right. So on a scale of 1 to 10, now we're moving on to communication. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate communication within your team? Now, again, this is within the team. Now, you may ask me and say, well, what do you mean by communication? It can mean many, many different things, and you're absolutely right. But that's the point. I actually want them, that is the person on the receiving end, to respond to this however they choose to respond. So I want them to interpret what communication is in their own mind. Why? Because that in itself can be very, very interesting and insightful for you as the leader. So what do they perceive communication to be? So there is no one definition of communication. It could be, of course, about respect and a value-based proposition, or it could be about, clarity, about instructions. It could be anything at all, but let them give you a score out of 10. Again, if you're on the receiving end of this, you should give this some thought. And then, of course, the next question, which is question 6, is why did you give it that rating? So the whole purpose of that then is to get some critical incidents or examples of why they would have rated it as they've rated it, you see. So you see what you're doing. You're actually assessing the climate. That's why we call it a climate review. And it's a very quick and easy and very insightful way of doing that when you have a conversation with each of the people that you lead. And of course, as a person on the receiving end of the conversation, it's a great opportunity for you to give some thought to job satisfaction, morale, and communication. Now, question 7 is also on communication, but you'll notice there's a distinction that we make here. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate communication outside you can say, our team? Now, this is the communication between the various aspects of the business. Now, it's not unusual, for example, that there can be some frustrations between so-called head office and branches, and that can be an issue in some businesses, and that's not unusual. But however the person on the receiving end wants to communicate that, so they'll give it a score. And of course, you're asking them then to give you some indication of why you've rated it as you've rated it. So, what I'm after is some examples, some critical incidents. If there's some opportunities for you as the leader to do something about anything that's mentioned in this conversation, or indeed any other conversation, then of course you can do that. But you might also realise, and it could be very useful for you as the leader to actually ask this question: is there anything that do you think that we can do about this? It's a great question because you can only get 3 responses. Yes, there is something we can do about it, or no, there's nothing we can do about it, or I'm not sure whether there's anything we can do about it. Now, if it's yes, then of course it opens up the possibilities to discuss what it is. If it's no, then as the leader, you can easily ask the person to just put it aside then, because there's nothing we can really do about it. And if you're not sure, of course, you can discuss it in greater length. And so this is communication between your team and other teams, essentially. And question 9 is really a question around, is there anything else that you'd like to comment on in relation to job satisfaction, morale, and communication? So you just let that person, if they want to talk about other things, other issues, or perhaps they haven't finished what they'd said earlier and they wanted to just add something to what they've said. Now, let me explain why this is really exciting for you. Organisations all over the world spend, in some cases, tens if not hundreds of thousands of dollars implementing what we call engagement surveys. And what they tend to do is they send out these surveys online, people respond to them, the results are collated. What happens, of course, is that people then put them in a drawer or file them away electronically. Perhaps they get spoken about at a management meeting and nothing happens. And there's absolutely no benefit in that, really. It's just a waste of time and energy, and it annoys people. And what you do find is that the level of participation in these engagement surveys goes down and down and down, which is quite paradoxical, isn't it, considering it's an engagement survey. And the reason it goes down is because people don't feel that taking the time and the effort is really worth it. But by having a conversation with people face to face right across your business, you're actually doing exactly what these engagement surveys do. But the wonderful thing about it is you're getting first-hand feedback immediately. And for some things, you can do something about it. And for other things, it might just be an interest as to why people have rated as such. So don't get defensive if people rate something at 2 or whatever. Some people are hard markers. Remember, the score's not the critical thing here. The actual key questions are 2, 4, 6, 8, and 9. So these are the questions of why. These are the real questions of essence. So you can see, I hope, the reason that we're going into the process that we are. Now, I want to talk about some tips and hints to help you all to have richer conversations. Now, these are fairly generic, and I think they apply to all the conversations, and I can share with you some of my experience here to make your conversations more effective. So I've decided to call the person on the receiving end of the conversation, as you can see on your screen, the coachee, and I've decided to call the leader or the manager the coach. Now, you call it whatever you want, just for argument's sake, and I put down some bullet points that I think are critically important for both and to think about before you go into these conversations. So for the people on the receiving end of the conversation, that is the coaches, I did mention earlier, it is important to prepare. Why? Because it's you want it, you want to be prepared and ready to give a good response. So you just have to look over the questions that I've sent you or will send you. It's just a matter of then thinking, well, how would I rate my job satisfaction? Okay, I'd probably rate it about a 6. All right, I think I'd rate it a 6 is because, every day there's a fair bit of stress and that's quite unpleasant, but on other days it's quite pleasant dealing with members of the public. But overall, I'd probably rate a 6. So I've already given it some thought so that when I'm asked that question, which you will be, and of course it's not about reading the questions off, but you know that that's the essence of what someone's going to ask you, you're ready to go. So it should add to a richer conversation. Another thing that I think is important is that if your leader hasn't scheduled a conversation with you, and really this is the start right now, so after today, right, at 10:30 today, you can start your conversations, frankly, and I would encourage you to start as soon as possible. If you haven't heard anything, then take the initiative and contact your leader and say, I'm ready to have my conversation. That puts a little bit of pressure on them to find the time and effort. Bearing in mind, being sensitive and aware of this, that some of your leaders have got several, well, a lot of them have got several of these conversations to have. So they've got to juggle them in and around what they're currently doing, and that's not always easy to do. So it's of course, it's up to the leader how they might do that. But bear in mind, you've got 2 months to knock off one conversation with each person. It's not a big ask. 8 weeks. Now, if the you can agree to disagree. So it's the best way to deal with where there's a disagreement is just to say, well, I agree to disagree. Just accept that your leader has a different point of view to what you have. You're not going to agree on everything, and nor do we think you should. And in fact, trust isn't about agreeing on everything. You might want to think about that. Trust is actually knowing where you stand with other people is more than anything. So if you have a different point of view to your boss, I think you should be assertive enough to say that. And I think you should feel comfortable doing that. And you should feel comfortable just agreeing to disagree, because it's perfectly okay to do that. And in fact, that's, if we all agreed on everything, it'd be a pretty boring old world, I think. Now, the other thing I want you to remember, and this is very important, is that this is not some transactional performance review in disguise. This is not about trying to, have a performance review and call it something else. So please don't. I would argue that these are developmental conversations. So this is about your development. It's not about appraising your performance. All right. So this is not about judging or evaluating. This is about having a conversation about your development. So it's important you get that clear in your head that we're not out to try and appraise anybody and in their performance. That's not what it's about. Now, if you're the so-called coach, if you're the person who is basically administering these conversations, and there'd be a few of you in this webinar, here's a couple of things you might like to consider. Consider the questions from your own perspective. Now, yeah, it's probably a good idea for you to think yourself, how would I have responded to that? Now, in some cases, of course, you may be the meat in the sandwich, so you might have to, some of you will have to have a conversation, and some of you will be on the receiving end of a conversation. So obviously you need to start to think from your own perspective how you would rate those things. And you'd have to think from your own perspective how you might give examples for each of those. So do so, and the more you do, the more you'll feel comfortable about the conversation. Now, book a time and a place mutually suitable, and I realise probably the convenient thing would be to book the time and the place for you and how it's convenient for you, but just have some empathy for the people that you're working with. We're all busy people, and try and find a time where both parties, can feel comfortable, because there's nothing more agitating than having a forced conversation when you really don't want to. So the point is to check to see whether it might be a good time to do that. I would formally schedule them in. I don't think it's a case of just doing it on an ad hoc basis. I think it's important and it's courteous to let the other person know when you would like to have the conversation with them. And the other thing I'd say, and I mentioned this last week, is to try to meet out of the workplace. So go and have a cup of coffee or get out of the place of work, because you will find that you will have better conversations that way. In Australia, it was only 2 weeks ago, I had a gentleman who was a leader in a large organisation who he had his conversations walking around the park. So they happened to be in the city here in Brisbane, and there was a botanical park close by. And he decided that he'd have his conversations just taking a stroll around the park. And it worked extremely well. So that's the beauty of this, is you don't need to sort of be sitting behind a big black mahogany desk in someone's office. In fact, I'd argue you shouldn't. So I'd strongly urge you not to have them in an office if you do have an office, and to get out and about. You'll find it's much, much better that way. So refer to the questions, but obviously don't read them off. It's not a case of you sitting there and reading them word for word. It was funny. I must tell you an amusing story. I had a solicitor, I was working in a large law firm, Thanks, Angus. Angus says, have you seen the Scottish weather? You better stay indoors. Oh dear. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. You might have a terrible conversation outside. Yeah, okay. Whatever. But anyway, not in your office. I think that's an important point. Thank you. But I was working with this law firm, and one of the partners who was sitting in the workshop, I was doing this face to face because I could do that. And he said halfway through the workshop, he said, "Look, I think this is a bit phony, this process." And I said, "What do you mean phony?" And he said, I don't feel comfortable reading these questions off." And of course, everyone was shuffling in their seat, a little bit embarrassed because obviously that wasn't the name of the game. The name of the game is those 9 things that I've given you. You need to just be aware of them. You can even have a copy of them with you, of course. But honestly, it's about you asking in the context of your work. So, it's just about having a natural conversation. And look, the other thing is be patient. Some people are shy, quiet by nature. Let them just, don't fill the space just because there's a space there. Let them talk because that's the whole purpose of asking the question. And just sit back and relax and let the person take their time. Of course, there are other people you might find hard to shut up. That's another whole issue. You might have to paraphrase what they're saying and then move on to the next. So I'll be interested to hear what feedback we have when we get people together at that point. Be respectfully curious. Ask questions like why, what, where, who, how, and which. All of those questions will give more than a one-word answer, and I think that's the critical thing, that you're actually asking people, you're drawing people out. A successful conversation in my book, in this approach, would be where you're doing 50% of the talking and the other person's doing 50% of the talking. To me, that sounds a pretty good balance. But if you're the leader and you're doing 80% of the talking and there's only 20% coming back, not good. Or if you're the leader and you're doing 20% and the other person's doing 80, that mightn't be ideal either. Because we want you to engage in what's being said, just like you're having a conversation about anything. All right, so that's pretty much it. Does anyone else have any comments or questions apart from the weather? Because I didn't actually think about that. The weather here in Brisbane is beautiful at this stage of the year, I can assure you. It's around 22, 23 degrees, hardly any rain, no clouds in the sky, and all that sort of stuff. So I won't say too much more about that. Anything else that people would like to ask um, before we sign out? Because I'm more than happy to field any question. Okay. Right. Trust is essential. Should the conversation be done by immediate line manager? Yes, I really believe, Angus, that is the way to go. I think that it is about that. It's about building leadership capability up as well. So I'd like it to be arranged so that the immediate supervisor, so anyone theoretically, well, not theoretically, in practice, anyone that's in any sort of supervisory leadership role should be, running conversations. So I'd really appreciate that, because I think otherwise it lets people off the hook. And I think sometimes the people who at the so-called coal face, the people who are closest to the action, can have a better conversation than the person who's the next level up. So I think it should be structured like that, absolutely. Okay, so every person in the hierarchy has an opportunity to have a conversation if they're in a leadership role, or to actually administer that. So yeah, thanks. That's a good question. Anybody else? And trust is critically important, obviously, as well. All right. Well, okay. Thanks, folks. I look forward to hearing the war stories. I don't think there will be any war. I think there should be some good experiences come out of it. So just relax, just enjoy it. You will find that it's easier than you probably would imagine. It's quite fun and it gives you a good perspective on where people are at. And all the while, we're trying to achieve those three objectives that I mentioned earlier. So I wish you well. And of course, I'm always open to any feedback via email as well. So you can either pass that through Phil or perhaps directly to me, whatever works for you. So thanks, guys. All the best. Next time you hear from me, you'll get a copy of the slides plus the audio or the recording. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day, as I'll have a good rest of the evening. Thank you and goodbye.